dia a todos e todas e todos, todes. Nós aqui, é um prazer estar aqui apresentando novamente, agora já na 7ª, ou seja, penúltima conferência do professor David Konstan, dentro do programa Vingança, Retribuição e Reconciliação, da Antiguidade aos dias atuais, como parte do programa, ciclo de atividades, que faz parte desse programa Cesar Lattes, do Cientista Visitante, do Instituto de Estudos Avançados aqui da Unicamp. Desta feita, nós vamos ter como tema Vingança e Retribuição, Retribution, some case studies, alguns estudos de caso. Eu digo Retribution porque não conseguimos encontrar uma tradução melhor, né? Retribuição, retaliação, compensação, né? Retribuição em português tem um sentido muito positivo e retribution, nesse caso, significa, no contexto do professor, essa noção de justiça enquanto compensação ou mesmo retaliação. Hoje nós contaremos como participantes com a professora Judith Herman, que eu apresentarei mais propriamente quando ela for se manifestar, uma professora de psiquiatria da Universidade de Harvard, best-seller sobre o tema de abuso sexual. E teremos também a professora Paula da Cunha Correia, professora titular da USP, da área de grego antigo. Com isso, a gente continua essa tradição, né, dentro dessas conferências do David Konstan, de tentar apontar, né, sempre um estudioso de literatura clássica, de estudos clássicos, de história antiga, do mundo antigo em geral, com alguém que também seja especializado em temas relevantes da abordagem ao texto antigo. Queria agradecer a presença de todos, se eu não fiz ainda, tanto presencial, tanto aqui ao vivo quanto online, né? Nós temos um amplo público online. Registrar a presença do coordenador do IDEA, o professor Cristiano Lira, que é professor da área de engenharia elétrica, o professor Mário Martínez, que é emérito da área de matemática e professor, presidente do Conselho Científico Cultural do IDEA, os professores da casa, né, a professora Patrícia Prata, da área de latim, professor nosso sênior e inspirador nos estudos clássicos, o professor Paulo Sérgio de Vasconcelos, professor Marcos Aurélio Pereira, também da área de latim, e o professor Flávio Ribeiro de Oliveira, da área de grego. São os que eu estou enxergando aqui. Também o professor Alexandre Cunha, da área de direito, de várias universidades aqui de Campinas, e os alunos do curso. Depois dessa longa introdução que eu sempre faço, agradeço, então, sua presença e somos todos ouvidos.
Muito obrigado, Isabela e Arturo. And now I begin again in English. The movies are a great database for stories of revenge. As Paul Doro, in an article on the movies and revenge, writes, big screen vigilantism is as American as baseball and apple pie. I don't know whether apple pie is really only American. From early Westerns, going back almost 100 years through the present, audiences continue to respond enthusiastically to stories of men, and it is almost always men, taking the law into their own hands after the justice system inevitably fails them. These men fervently and violently carve out a path of destruction in their quest for vengeance as they shoot, stab, beat, and blow up anyone who deserves it. Doro distinguishes the type of film that features a trained assassin, for example, somebody with military or law enforcement experience. His example is the Dirty Harry films starring Clint Eastwood, from those in which an ordinary man is moved to seek vengeance, He sees these as two types. In the latter kind, where an ordinary person is moved, Doro observes typically they are avenging the murder of a spouse or child. Although the professional types also have that. A very famous movie, The Big Sleep, is that kind of professional policeman whose wife has been assassinated. Here, his model is Death Wish, starring Charles Bronson, who, by the way, like Clint Eastwood, got his start in the so-called spaghetti westerns directed by Sergio Leone. Some of you will remember these. Once Upon a Time in the West was a brilliant movie, and that starred Bronson and Henry Fonda and others, and Claudia Cardinale, but those were really marvelous movies. As Doro summarizes the story of Death Wish, Paul Kersey, a liberal architect in New York City, becomes a vigilante after his wife and daughter are violently attacked in their home. His wife is killed, and his daughter is gravely injured. Death Wish depicts New York City as a war zone, entirely overrun with criminals. The police are outnumbered and outgunned in addition to being incompetent. Kersey had been a pacifist, but, and I quote again, he becomes a one-man killing machine who single-handedly reduces violent crime across the entire city. What is more, the film claims he has no choice. The only way things will change is if someone takes the law into their own hands. Only the individual can bring about this kind of transformation. Doro argues that the rare revenge films with a female protagonist as the Avenger diverge from the pattern of sheer violence. We will return to the question of gender and violence shortly, but I wish first to consider a story of revenge which has also appeared on the silver screen. That's how we refer to the movies sometimes, on the silver screen, but which goes back to ancient Rome. The most basic version we owe to the historian Livy, but it was much expanded by Plutarch, who depended heavily on another Roman historian, Greek historian, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and it was adapted most famously as a tragedy by Shakespeare. I am referring not to Julius Caesar, which would also have been possible, but to Coriolanus. The story, more or less in the version that Livy tells it, the short version, goes as follows. Shortly after the expulsion of the kings and the establishment of the Republic, somewhere in the 6th century BC in Rome, there was a severe class conflict in Rome due to the oppression of the plebeian class, the lower classes, by the patricians, who repeatedly failed to honor their promises to alleviate the debts of the poor. The poor were becoming increasingly indebted. The plebeians seceded, they moved out, and established themselves on a nearby hill. There's some question among scholars about which hill. And after negotiations, they succeeded in winning 2 new offices, that is to say, behind the consuls and the senators, 2 new offices, the so-called tribunes of the people. They were to represent the people as such, whereas the Senate was occupied only by the elite, who were the patrician class. And a war broke out with the nearby Volscians. This is a war between Rome and Volscians, in which a certain Gaius or Gnaeus Marcius distinguished himself by vanquishing the city of Corioli. So let me just happen, we're in a new thing. There's been a secession. The plebes have moved back to Rome, away from their protected hill, with the granting of 2 new offices, the tribunes, and at this point a war breaks out, and a certain Marcius distinguishes himself, and in the battle with the Volscians, conquers their city Corioli, and so wins the cognomen Coriolanus. Let me just very briefly remind you that Romans had 3 names. Most, by law, they had 2. Marcus is his first name, and Gnaeus, is his first name, and Marcius is his second name. But he then gets a third name, Coriolanus, in honor of his achievement. That's the cognomen. Because the people did not cultivate the fields while they were still seceding, there occurred a great famine, which the Senate alleviated by importing grain. The plebeians demanded that the price of the grain be set at pre-famine levels. You see what's happening here. Because there's no grain and it has to be imported, the Senate want to charge more for two reasons. One is it's expensive to import grain, and secondly, it's a market price. If there's a famine, the price goes up. And what the plebeians wanted to do was to set the price at what it was before the famine. But Coriolanus insisted that they must first restore the former privileges of the Senate as the sole authority by abolishing the offices of the tribune. His argument was, you want to go back to pre-famine times? Okay, let's do it on both fronts. We'll give you the food, but we take away the tribunes that you have insisted on. On the verge of being impeached and furious at the affront to his honor, Coriolanus went into exile, installing himself among the Volscians, those are the very enemies of Rome, and taking their side in hostilities with Rome and leading the attack against his own city. Having conquered towns allied with Rome, he laid siege to Rome itself. At the insistence of the plebeians, ambassadors and then priests were sent to negotiate with Coriolanus, but he refused them an audience. He didn't even see them. Finally, the Roman matrons, the mothers, approached Coriolanus' mother and wife. They have different names in Livy and Plutarch, and they, accompanied by Coriolanus' two sons, approached the enemy camp. At their entreaties, when they begged, Coriolanus agreed to withdraw his troops from Roman territory. Livy says that he lived out the rest of his life in exile, but says that there were other versions. Plutarch and Shakespeare have him murdered by the Volscians, who were resentful that he betrayed their cause by retreating from the siege. Now, I have narrated the plot of this story in some detail because I want to contrast it with the story of Death Wish. In Death Wish, we have an example of what we might call vigilante justice. A man takes revenge for the murder of his wife and the maiming of his daughter by taking aim at all malefactors, all criminals, assuming the role of judge and enforcer. It is assumed that he can distinguish between violent criminals and ordinary citizens, whom he protects rather than harms. So he's your policeman in action where the police fail. The film appeals to those who have been a victim of such abuse or imagine that they might be. The hero satisfies their desire, our desire, to stand up to those who terrorize us and also to make them suffer in return. Coriolanus, on the other hand, is motivated by an assault on his dignity by those whom he deems inferior in status. So he's not been hurt in any physical way. No relative of his has been harmed. On the contrary, as you saw, his mother and wife are fine, the children are fine, completely different from the story in Death Wish. He is alienated from his community. He's not protecting his community. He's alienated from his community. And he turns against his fellow citizens with the intention of reducing them to servitude in order to compensate for the outrage to which he had been subjected. You don't honor me, well, I will enslave you. If he gives up his intention, his design, it is because his mother and wife make it clear to them that they themselves, along with his children, will be enslaved by the victorious enemy. This is not enough to assuage his rage entirely, but it does inhibit him from executing his revenge. So you see the contrast I'm drawing. One is against the criminals, compensating justly for where the authorities have failed, and in a sense, protecting his fellow citizens The other has suffered an insult to his honor, not to any other sense, and withdraws and attacks his fellow citizens for the reason. I would like to suggest that these two stories are paradigmatic of two motives for revenge or retribution, and furthermore, that we may compare them with the two types of vengeance exacted in the Iliad and Odyssey. The Charles Bronson character in Death Wish is like Odysseus. He is deeply hurt, traumatized would not be too strong a word, by what happened to his family, and he's now prepared to eliminate anyone who has done or might do something similar. Excuse me. His revenge smacks of retribution. He cannot undo what has been done, but he can make sure that the offenders pay for it. So too, Odysseus avenges an assault on his family, killing everyone involved and anyone prepared to defend or avenge them. His whole citizen body, at the end of the poem. They did wrong. They must suffer the penalty. There is a strong element of retribution, which explains also the cool and calculating attitude of the Bronson character. As Doro remarks, the legitimacy of what Kersey does is never questioned. His victims got what they deserved. He is simply restoring order by doing what law enforcement is supposed to do. Coriolanus bears rather a resemblance to Achilles, I'm claiming. See, one is the Odyssey, the other is the Iliad. He has been mortified by insults to his honor, coming in this case from the lower classes, but confirmed by his peers, who refused to lend him their unconditional support. Thais, I'm sorry, but we can hear the conversation from back there? Okay. So what does he do, Achilles? He withdraws, and in his anger, he seeks to punish the offenders, all the Greeks, by endorsing, let me come back to Coriolanus. Coriolanus withdraws, and in his anger, he punishes the offenders by endorsing the victory of the Volscians, just as Achilles had prayed for the success of the Trojans. Both men are finally appeased by appeals from those who are most dear to them. Coriolanus by his mother and wife, Achilles by Patroclus, even if it requires Patroclus' death before Achilles is wholly reconciled to fighting again on the Greek side. So you see the parallels that I'm drawing? You have a character, withdraws, wishes for the success of the enemy, finally is appeased to come back by the person who is closest to him. Now, of course, Patroclus is not the wife of Achilles, certainly not the mother, and yet there is an even closer parallel, perhaps, if we recall a suggestion made by the great Greek scholar Ioannis Kakridis. We have seen, you remember, that Agamemnon, when he was desperate, sent 3 ambassadors to persuade Achilles to return to the battle. That was Achilles rejected this great offer at that time, if you remember. One was Odysseus, and another was Ajax, and the third, which I didn't mention, was a character named Phoenix, who was something of a foster father to Achilles. In fact, he reminds Achilles of how when Achilles was a baby, he used to clean his mouth after he ate and wipe his behind and so on. You know, he was really like appointed a foster father to Achilles. In order to persuade Achilles to relent and go back to battle, Phoenix tells him the story of another hero, Meleager, who was stubborn right to the end, would not be reconciled, resisting the appeals first of his friends, think of Odysseus and Ajax, then his father, think of Phoenix as a kind of father, and finally his own wife. So in other words, Meleager didn't listen to his friends, didn't listen to his father figure, his father, and he didn't even listen to his own wife. In this sense, it's the contrary of the behavior of Coriolanus, who did listen to his wife. What Kakridis noticed was 2 things. One, that there was this parallel. First the friends, then the father figure, then the closest person, who was on the one side the wife, and on the other side Patroclus. But the wife is given a name, and her name is Cleopatra. Homer tells us her name was Cleopatra. And what Kakrides noticed was that Cleopatra is Patroklos in reverse. The Patra part is from father, and the kleos part is from the word kleos, that very famous word, the undying kleos, the aphiton kleos, that every Greek warrior aspires to. And so we might say that in the story, as Kakrides suggested, Patroklos plays the wife role. Now, there's no suggestion of homosexuality in this context. That's not the point. The point is simply that when you have this scale of intimacy, you end up with the closest person, who is the one who finally persuades. And so I'm arguing this for this analogy between Achilles' case and the case of Coriolanus. Where one's sense of personal dignity is at stake, however right or wrong that individual's judgment may be, whether Coriolanus was right, whether Achilles was right, one wants to restore one's honor in the eyes of the community at large. Where the community fails to provide adequate recognition, the injured party may be moved to reject the community entirely, the avenging hero who serves the wider community by destroying its enemies. The Odysseus paradigm is one of triumph. The Achilles paradigm is, we might say, one of shame. Shame is a self-annihilating experience and much harder to heal. As I mentioned earlier, Doro sees a difference in the way women avengers are represented in the cinema. He offers as his chief example a film called The Brave One, in which the heroine, named Erica, avenges the murder of her boyfriend, notice again the motivation, and becomes in her own right something of a vigilante murderer. You lost someone, you come back in order to make things right. Doro says, Erica then is securing justice for women who have been victimized by men. The conclusion absolves Erica, but it does not cure her or suggest that everything is going to be fine. Vigilantism does not heal Erica. She will continue to be haunted by her actions. She will not go to prison, but that does not mean she is free. Erica is not a ruthless and remorseless killer. She is a complex, three-dimensional character, and that is something that is rare in vigilante films. So this is the difference. When women assume the role of vigilantism, they are represented as having more complex motivations and characters. Now, we could think of exceptions, like Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill movies, where they may, and we may also note differences in the way men and women avengers are represented. This may be due to cultural stereotypes shared by both sexes and by non-binary people as well, reflecting a history in which such narratives were constructed by and for men. These stories are men's versions of men's vigilantism. For this reason, it is of special interest to hear women's actual voices. Let me just pause for a moment to what the transition that I'm making here. It's one thing to see movies, even movies about women, when they are based on certain cultural suppositions, presuppositions, our stereotypes of men and women. Even if women are represented as more profoundly moved, as more complex characters, perhaps that in itself is due to a masculine vision of women as being more sensitive, more homebound. And so what I'm suggesting here is that if we could hear the voices of women themselves who have suffered such abuse when it comes to revenge, retribution, and reconciliation, that would be a particularly interesting movement. And so I turn now to a remarkable book by Judith Herman with the title Truth and Repair: How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice, which appeared just this past March, 2 months ago. I quote here first, later we'll come to the book, from an article that Herman published in the magazine The Nation. This is the oldest continuously running magazine in the United States, very prestigious, summarizing her findings. And now I'm quoting from what Judith Herman wrote in the article, her own article. When the notorious predator Harvey Weinstein was twice convicted of sexual assault and sentenced to prison, he joined the estimated 1% of rapists who are actually punished for their crimes. Making an example of him is certainly instructive to the wider community that has tolerated such abuses for years, but it may provide cold comfort to the survivors of his abuse. This is because survivors' visions of justice often differ greatly from the resolution that the criminal justice system offers. So the criminal justice system sentenced him to prison. The survivors wanted something else, perhaps. Rather than simply punishing one particularly egregious offender, they wanted their communities to hold everyone who enabled his crimes to be held accountable. So here is what they wanted. They wanted something that extended beyond the punishment of the individual, beyond the vigilante attitude, we might say. They wanted the community to acknowledge its responsibility. Herman cites the following remarks in illustration. This is one of her people that she has interviewed. As Daniel, a survivor of childhood sexual abuse by a Catholic priest in the Boston Archdiocese, told me, he wanted some consequences for Cardinal Bernard Francis Law. Now, the cardinal wasn't the one who abused him, but the cardinal was the one on top, who had knowingly covered up hundreds of cases over decades. She quotes him, "I'd like to see him stripped of his position of authority, his big diamond ring and his scepter and all that. I'd like to see him do something humbling, community service, that's not schmoozing," that's colloquial English for just chatting with people. Not fun, not glamorous. They should sell his mansion and give the proceeds to victims. Herman has worked for over half a century with victims of violence, and for her book, she conducted interviews with 26 women and 4 men to find out what they thought justice meant. As she says, "I asked what would make things right, or as right as possible for them, and what they thought the consequences should be for the offenders and the bystanders." She inquired specifically about anger and vengeful sentiments, and also how they regarded forgiveness. All issues at the very heart of the series of lectures that we have been conducting. Herman discovered that the victims most desired 3 things: acknowledgement, apology, and accountability. This is what they wanted. I guess I could call them the 3 A's. Acknowledgement is the most revealing of the 3, and I quote Herman's own words on this dimension. So here's what she says. "Every survivor I interviewed, and I dare say every survivor with whom I have ever worked, and that's a large group, has wished above all for community acknowledgement and vindication." And you see now why I'm thinking of Achilles and Coriolanus here. Survivors want the truth to be recognized and the burden of shame to be lifted from their shoulders, to be placed where it belongs, on the perpetrators. They want the turning around of this dimension of social recognition and esteem. They want the crime to be denounced by those in their communities who matter to them, including the authorities of the law. The reaction of others is crucial. As Herman puts it, the actions or inactions of bystanders, all those who are complicit in these crimes, like the cardinal, who prefer not to know about it, or who blame the victims, often cause even deeper wounds. Now, allowing for the vast difference in the situations of the men and women whom Herman interviewed, and powerful warriors like Achilles and Coriolanus, I think there is something in common in their experiences. They have not only been shamed and dishonored, they also feel betrayed by the others who failed to acknowledge what they had suffered. Their withdrawal from their communities expresses their fundamental alienation, yes, on a grand canvas and for different causes, not sexual abuse, but a failure on the part of their peers to recognize their special qualities. But we can see the sense of humiliation that afflicts them, and this is crucial to understanding the victims and survivors of sexual abuse. When it comes to, I always do this, you know my habit. I check the time to make sure I'm not abusing your patience. and that you don't afterwards want some form of vengeance. When it comes to apologies, Herman notes a curious attitude. The survivors, I'm quoting her, I interviewed, cared more about apologies from bystanders than from the perpetrators. This again gets to the heart of the matter. It's not just a question of humbling or harming the violators. It is the social acceptance of the offense that peaks, that causes the injury. Indeed, as Herman notes, insincere apologies compound the harm, and the quotation there. And as we have noted earlier in these lectures, sincerity is often very difficult to confirm. How do I know when you apologize you're sincere? And so that only makes it worse if I'm thinking you're just doing it in order to get off the hook, or in sincerity. As you remember, I've argued that apologies and the whole notion of forgiveness have their origin in the Bible. And in the Bible, the person whom you are apologizing to is God. And God knows whether you're sincere or not. But when it comes to us mortals, this is a problem in and of itself. And again, reiterating a point that we discussed in connection with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if you remember, in other contexts, and again, I'm quoting Judith Herman, apologies can sometimes lead to forgiveness and reconciliation, but social pressures for forgiveness can also be a trap for survivors. You remember that we talked about how in Bishop Tutu's account of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, people who could not forgive and could not accept the apologies were regarded as somehow deficient. They had to grow to learn to do this. That's the social pressure. One point, however, stands out in victims' reactions. As Herman puts it, most seemed remarkably uninterested in punishment for the men who had hurt them. They wanted the perpetrators to be exposed and subject to public outrage, but they much preferred the idea of rehabilitation to imprisonment. To put it another way, in terms that may remind us of Aristotle, the issue is to restore the balance of respect, not simply to eliminate the offender, which is the objective, according to Aristotle, of hatred rather than anger. When you're angry, you want the balance of relationship to be restored. Your status has been diminished. Remember, for Aristotle, it's a slight, it's a diminishment, it's an insult, it's a put-down that causes anger. And you want to get over that by reestablishing the proper equilibrium. In the case of hatred, you just want to eliminate the other person. But respect is not just an individual matter. It is rooted in society, and where there are glaring inequities of gender, ethnicity, age, and other markers, it is all the more difficult for victims who belong to subordinated groups to achieve genuine recognition. Herman imagines a world in which there are new structures where everyone is respected, everyone is included, and everyone has a voice. But in the here and now, she concludes, survivors need truth and repair, acknowledgement, apology, amends, and accountability, 4 A's, I guess, from their communities. When the community comes through with these reparations, the damaged relationship between the community and the survivor is healed, trust is restored, and a better kind of justice is done. What about the anger that victims feel then? Is that anger assuaged by acknowledgement? In her brief article in The Nation, Herman does not spend much time on anger. It was a very short article, but she does explain its nature in her book. First, she observes the ways in which anger is denied, not by the victims, but to the victims. They're not allowed to feel anger. As she writes, and I quote her, "The righteous anger of women and other subordinated groups, which violates dominant norms of compliant and willing submission, is always particularly threatening. Anger is a most unwelcome sentiment from the crime victims whom the dominant community would most prefer to ignore." And I remind you here, I should have quoted it in this context, of Aristotle's view that slaves don't even feel anger because they can't get revenge. And that if a slave talks back, I didn't mention this earlier, if a slave talks back to his master, even trying to justify himself, that can make the master more angry because the slave is treating himself as the master's equal. What should a slave do? Act humbly, lower his eyes. As Aristotle puts it, and Aristotle, just because of his frankness and clarity, can be very appalling. He says, you know, dogs do not bark at people when they're sitting. That's his analogy. Herman quotes the view of Martha Nussbaum, a very eminent scholar, a very important scholar, as absolutely and personally a dear friend of my own, who, in her largely negative and stoic account of anger, this is Nussbaum, describes it as one of the vices of victimhood. You're a victim and you get angry, and that's a vice. Now, Herman says that the general societal condemnation of victims' anger is so reflexive and deep that it amounts to a taboo. If you've been hurt, you should not be angry. That you should be calm. She cites Susan Jacobi for the view that victims must show that they are free of vindictive rage and demonstrate that what they desire is justice rather than revenge. That's the way you get attention in this world. Herman's own view is that the victim's anger is a function of social response. As she writes, in fact, victims' anger has everything to do with the way the community responds to the wrongs inflicted upon them. Retributive anger, what I would call blind rage or humiliated fury, is what people feel when they are alone and abandoned to their fate. The wish to retaliate is born of isolation and helplessness. Once again, we think of characters who have been alienated from their communities. Very different. Herman cites the essay Revenge is Sour by George Orwell, in which he argues that revenge is an act which you want to commit when you are powerless and because you are powerless. As soon as the sense of impotence is removed, the desire evaporates also. Orwell gives the example of humiliating SS, those are the Nazi officers, at the end of the Second World War. In anticipation, it is attractive. But when the thing becomes possible, Orwell says, it's merely pathetic and disgusting. You have, these were terrible people and they committed terrible crimes. And you want to avenge them. Now, the war is over. They're in your power. What would you want to do? Beat them up? Hit them on the head with a stick? Once you can do it, once the balance of power has been restored, once you are no longer excluded from the community but are the representative of the community, you could feel a bit disgusted at your own desire to behave this way, retaliate in the way that they treated you. That's Orwell's point. According to Herman, and I quote her, it is only when victims are denied their fair measure of justice that their anger can fester as helpless rage. And here's an important distinction. Anger is a good thing, and it should be permitted. It's only when you don't allow the anger, refuse to allow them anger, that it grows and grows and grows and becomes helpless rage. We may perhaps see an illustration of Herman's point in Achilles' behavior in abusing the corpse of Hector. He can get no satisfaction from such an act and must eventually give it up. So too, fantasies of tormenting concentration camp officers are futile once they are dead. But is this equally true when they are still alive and can be brought to some kind of horrified recognition of what they did and who they were? We have seen that, according to Aristotle, there is pleasure in anger deriving precisely from the anticipation of revenge. Once revenge is achieved, and the offender has been made to feel the same kind of diminution that she or he has inflicted, then anger comes to an end. Since anger just is the desire for revenge, and you can't desire what you already have. Well, once you've gotten your revenge, it's over. But for Aristotle, anger is precisely the motivation for undoing the effects of a slight. Anger is what drives you. It's a sign that you've been diminished. This is not helpless rage. If one were helpless, then you can't feel anger because revenge would be impossible, and we cannot realistically desire what it is impossible to achieve. This is Aristotle's point. Remember, we don't feel, we can't really get angry at God. We can't really try. Why not? Because anger is a desire for revenge, and you cannot avenge yourself against God. This is why we are less likely to be angry with tyrants, with kings, with people with absolute power. You can't get vengeance against them, and once you admit this in yourself, deeply, deep inside your character, you just accept your inferior status and take it. You take it on the chin and let it go. Aristotle does recognize an emotion similar to what we call indignation. His word for it is nemesis, you know the word. And for Aristotle, it's the opposite of pity. We feel pity when someone is suffering undeserved misfortune, and indignation when someone is suffering undeserved good fortune. It's a sound moral emotion, but it's different from anger, which concerns insults that compromise our own standing. And yet, I think that Aristotle's view of anger and revenge may not be so different from Hermann's after all. The feeling of being diminished is not just a private sense. It depends on our perception of how others regard us. This is clearly the case of Achilles and Coriolanus. What piques them, what irritates them, is that no one takes their part, even among those who might be expected to side with them. That's what goads them to fury. It is the sense of isolation that Hermann evokes. Coriolanus, his own fellow senators betray him. Achilles, the other Greek leaders betray him. That's the thing. Aristotle's world, with its competitive sense of honor, is different from ours, no doubt, but not that different. We too, although we do not use the same terms, know what it is to have our dignity compromised. It's a social fact, and this, I think, is the core element in resentment and the motivation to revenge. All now this summarizing. What then of the films of vengeance, which are so popular these days? I am moved to suggest that these films may better be described as stories of retribution rather than revenge. Although, as we have noted several times, there's no hard and fast line between the two when it comes to real life. Now, that doesn't mean that the theoretical distinction is useless, but just you have to allow for some complexity. What is more, it may be that of the two kinds of retaliation, revenge and retribution, revenge for an attack on your honor where motivated by anger, retribution for harm that is done to you, motivated by a sense of justice, this difference. It may be that of the two kinds, revenge is in fact the more socially constructive. This is a point I've been tending toward all along. This runs counter to popular intuition, according to which retribution aims at justice, whereas revenge, which is driven by anger and other emotions, seeks to harm the offender without regard for social benefit or the possibility of redemption. Stephen Feynman, in his book, Revenge, A Short Inquiry into Retribution, published in 2017, affirms that revenge is the ultimate statement of self and community, both a protective and a warning to others to keep away. Justice in the raw. So revenge is justice in the raw. And so he adds, we are all avengers at heart, but our heads tell us differently. We are taught that revenge should be suppressed, diverted, or dealt with by the authorities. There are justice systems intended to limit revenge and stop it from spiraling out of control. See, revenge can get out of control, out of hand, and we need justice systems to keep them there. And he explains, Feynman explains, revenge cannot replace what is lost, such as property, a family member, or a friend, but it can restore attendant losses, such as pride and honor. Now, here I want to focus very clearly. One thing is to lose a family, another thing is to lose your honor. And he calls honor an attendant loss, a loss that is secondary, an ancillary loss upon losing your property. In these circumstances, it is rational to seek revenge, as Nietzsche notes, and he quotes Nietzsche, if our honor has suffered through our adversary, revenge can restore it. You see, revenge can restore this, but it cannot restore the family that you've lost. By revenge, we prove that we're not afraid of him either. And herein lies the settlement, the readjustment. Third-party retaliation by the law cannot do this. Feynman gives some grisly examples of revenge fantasies, which all of us, I imagine, have had at one time or another. I know I've had some fantasies of revenge that are really quite titillating. I won't quote them here, since there is no need. Feynman concludes his brief survey as follows. Revenge, according to some, is futile because it cannot undo the harm done. Now notice how we're moved from revenge and honor to revenge and harm. But this misses the point about where to focus one's feelings of injustice. The family of a murdered relative will say that nothing can bring back their loved one, but that is no reason for making life easy for the murderer. There is an intense desire to balance suffering with suffering. Well, maybe so, but why? The urge for retribution lies deep within us and seeks ways around the moral and rational constraints we place on it. And here you might hear also echoes of Freud with his conception of the repression in civilized society that causes us to have a lesser feeling of happiness. Now, we may see in this paragraph evidence of the terminological confusion that marks the very title of the book, namely that between revenge and retribution. You'll remember that the book is entitled, find the title here, just a moment, because it matters. Where is the title of the book? It's a preceding page, is it? It has to be somewhere. Oh, yes, it's called Revenge, A Short Inquiry into Retribution. But that means revenge and retribution are the same. And there, I think, is the problem. Suppose we keep the two ideas distinct for purposes of analysis. Revenge turns out to be something that can achieve its objective, and furthermore is crucial to social relations, where it maintains equality of status. You can restore your honor. It's not necessary that you do, but it is at least possible, unlike bringing a loved one back to life. Yes, as Aristotle says, we wish to make the offender feel the kind of humiliation that has been inflicted on us, but that too is a social condition. Humiliation how? In the eyes of whom? That's the question we want to ask. Retribution, however, demands punishment in kind, an eye for an eye, and so forth, according to conceptions of fairness. You don't recover your own eye in the process. It seems to me that the victims and survivors whom Herman describes want revenge in the best sense, uncontaminated by fantasies of retribution. There's a certain analogy here, and we're now coming to near the end of our discussion, with the relationship between shame and guilt. Shame is often considered to be a primitive emotion, responding to the opinions of others. I can't be shamed when I'm myself. As opposed to guilt, which presupposes an internalized sense of right and wrong. Thomas Schaff, an eminent sociologist who spent most of his career studying shame, affirms, I quote him, "The denial of shame has been institutionalized in Western societies." Immediately after the Second World War, the anthropologist Ruth Benedict, in her book The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, introduced the distinction between what she called shame cultures and guilt cultures, with the latter representing a higher stage of moral awareness. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. The story was right after the Second World War. The two cultures that were being compared were Japan and the United States. Which do you think was called the shame culture and which was called the guilt culture? You get one guess. Of course, Japan was called the shame culture. Now, the fact that Germany was an ally of Japan and presumably was a guilt culture didn't seem to affect it. But she made that distinction, a higher kind of world where there was an internalized sense. By the way, this book, her book, was the subject of a good deal of criticism by Japanese scholars. However, Eric Dodds, the very great, eminent classicist, adopted this terminology. And he, in his famous book, The Greeks and the Irrational, it's a wonderful book title. It was lectures he gave at Berkeley, published in 1951, so only 5 years after Ruth Benedict's book appeared. The Greeks, in other words, we always think of the Greeks as the pinnacle of rationality. His book was the irrational side of the Greeks. And he regarded the world of Homer as a shame culture, which was slowly transformed into a guilt culture in the centuries that followed, but only fully achieved with the advent of Christianity, which was in some sense a superior sense of internalization. Psychologists, on the whole, tended either to ignore shame entirely or to treat it as a characteristic of the still incomplete socialization of the child. Why do we feel shame rather than guilt? Well, we haven't been fully developed morally. I take the liberty of quoting one example. Shame feelings precede the development of the superego, the conscience. Okay? Although they may later be integrated into superego formation, guilt develops later during the Oedipal phase and requires the presence of a superego. In other words, when you have a conscience, a fully developed, socialized conscience, then you feel guilt. Shame is the more primitive pre-Oedipal phenomenon. A revolution in the psychoanalytic understanding of shame occurred in the publication in 1971 of the book Shame and Guilt in Neurosis by the psychologist Helen Block Lewis. Lewis argued that shame was a much more intense emotion than guilt, since it entailed a sense of one's utter worthlessness, a collapse of the self, whereas guilt is limited to a negative feeling about a particular act. So when you're looking at shame and guilt this way, shame is very powerful. It exists in the adult as well as in the child, and guilt does too, but guilt is a limited thing. Okay, I permitted this, I did this wrong, I apologize, I take the responsibility for it, I pay the penalty, and that's that. There's nothing more to follow, whereas shame really destroys, corrodes the self. Lewis also, I'll skip that sentence because I don't think it's true anymore. Let me quote from an influential follower of Lewis, Donald Nathanson, in his 1992 book, Shame and Pride, Affect, Sex, and the Birth of the Self. Nathanson writes, whereas shame is about the quality of our person or self, guilt is the painful emotion triggered because we become aware that we have acted in a way to bring harm to another person or to violate some important code. Guilt is about action and laws. Whenever we feel guilty, we can pay for the damage inflicted. We can't do that with shame. Of course, guilt too has had a bad press, especially in our modern permissive culture, where we do everything to avoid arousing a sense of guilt in children. The recent controversy over teaching so-called critical race theory in schools in the United States is a case in point. Critical race theory puts a large degree of responsibility on white people for the oppression of blacks over the history of the United States. And many of the objections to teaching it to young children is that it causes them to feel guilty. And that's bad. They shouldn't feel guilty. Still, guilt has a certain dignity as a sentiment, while shame has continued to seem an infantile response. It is sometimes taken as a sign of the incomplete moral development of ancient Greek and Roman cultures and many others, that they seem to have no terminological distinction between our concepts of guilt and shame. What I mean by that very simply is that in English we have, and in Portuguese, we know one word for guilt, I guess it's culpa in Portuguese, and another word for shame, something like vergonça it would be. But in ancient Greek, there's just shame. There isn't a separate word for guilt. And you can say, I am ashamed of things, a loss of my status, or I'm ashamed for things I've done, either way. But the same word is used. And my point is that many have said that Greek culture was in some sense incompletely morally developed because it did not make the transition from being a shame culture to a Greek guilt culture. Well, as we have remarked several times, and now we really are coming to the end, Aristotle associated revenge with anger aroused by a slight or belittlement. But a belittlement or insult, when it goes unanswered, can also be a source of shame. A person is not simply put down, but is deeply mortified and no longer feels the respect that is due from one's peers in one's own community. As Judith Herman reported, and I quote her, remember, survivors want the truth to be recognized and the burden of shame lifted from their shoulders to be placed where it belongs, on the perpetrators. Achilles, after he was insulted by Agamemnon, felt like a homeless vagabond. Remember, he treated me as though I were a vagabond without a home. Shame demands social acknowledgement. It is a public sentiment. Guilt, on the contrary, corresponds to the idea of retribution. The guilty party must pay the penalty, and so an equilibrium is restored between the offender and the victim. This is justice at work. But what counts as sufficient compensation in the moral economy of guilt? What's enough? The law may set the terms, decide on the punishment, but it doesn't erase the harm. Hence our fantasies now not of revenge, but of retribution. The law, okay, he's been in jail, but that's not enough. And you remember one of our earlier lectures, we pointed out to people who were upset at the fact that the other abuser, who what's her name again, who killed himself in jail, wasn't there to suffer the consequences. And our fantasies of retribution, I argue, have no natural limit, unlike the moral recognition on the part of the community. Even when retribution is assigned to impersonal agencies, such as the state and its legal system, it remains imprisoned within the regime of tit for tat, harm for harm, damage for damage. Revenge, however, looks to transform not the relationship between the victim and the offender as such, the way programs of forgiveness and restorative justice do. Rather, as the people interviewed by Herman indicate, it asks for a change in the society and its way of viewing victim and victimizer. Revenge is the more radical and progressive emotion. It looks to changing the moral codes of the society at large and to eliminating the very basis of shame. I realize, in conclusion, that I may be guilty of ennobling revenge, converting it from a deeply vindictive sentiment to a more high-minded feeling closer to indignation than to anger. I agree that in common parlance, revenge manifests all the violence that I am ascribing to retribution. But then common parlance and even scholars will talk about revenge and retribution as though they're the same. Perhaps I ought rather to say that revenge does not always recognize its own motive. We may desire social acknowledgement, but we imagine that we simply want to make the offender suffer, and our fantasies reflect that desire. However, Herman's interlocutors, the people she was interviewing, understood the payback that revenge demands differently. When you really ask the people what they want, that's not how they look at it. To put it differently, when we are humiliated, there is not only personal damage, there is also a social stigma, which is the cause of our shame. Revenge seeks to undo that stigma, to lift the burden of shame from our shoulders, in Herman's phrase. Perhaps it is not wholly irrelevant or indiscreet to share with you the fact that Judith Herman is the daughter of Helen Block Lewis. And now, for a special surprise, we are going to have some words from Judith Herman herself, from Cambridge University, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and will be, before she speaks, a brief introduction in Portuguese by Isabella of Judith Herman and her achievements.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much in advance for your conference and also for the wonderful surprise, for the wonderful addition. Vou apresentar em português, então, a professora Judith Herman, que é professora de psiquiatria na Harvard Medical School, da Universidade de Harvard, portanto, diretora de treinamento das vítimas de violência, um programa do Departamento de Psiquiatria da Cambridge Health Alliance, na própria universidade, na cidade de Massachusetts. E ela também é fundadora do Women's Mental Health Collective, do coletivo de saúde mental feminino. Ela, enfim, dentre suas várias atuações e reconhecimentos, ela recebeu, em 96, o prêmio, que é o Lifetime Achievement Award da Sociedade Internacional de Estudos sobre o Estresse Traumático. E, em 2000, ela recebeu o prêmio da American Medical Women's Association. Em 2003, ela foi nomeada Distinguished Fellow, né, da Academia Psiquiátrica Americana, American Psychiatric Association. Dentre as muitas publicações, destacamos os seus 3 livros mais recentes: Trauma e Recuperação, O Poder da Violência, do Abuso Doméstico ao Terror Político, de 92. Em 2000, ela escreveu um livro sobre o incesto entre pai e filhos, publicado pela Harvard University Press. E o último seria esse, Truth and Repair, How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice, né? Verdade e reparação, como sobreviventes do trauma veem, né, a justiça, sobre o qual livros que o professor David mencionou durante a sua conferência. So, thank you very much, Professor Judith Herman. It's really a pleasure to have you here with us, and we are all ears.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you, David, for that very thought-provoking talk. I wanted to expand a little bit more on the idea of really on my mother's work on shame and guilt, because as Professor Konstan pointed out, it had the effect of elevating the status of the conqueror. In this case, the United States over the conquered. And in general, I think the esteeming of guilt as superior to shame is an attitude of the dominant group, because shame is about subordination. I was struck by the quote from Aristotle that that slaves should not, or perhaps could not, feel anger, that when they are mistreated, what slaves should do is lower their eyes. And that is the lowered eyes, the bowed head, the slumped shoulders, the posture of shame, the attempt to hide, is universal across cultures and over time. And that is because it is hardwired in the central nervous system, and it is similar to the displays of submission in social animals. For example, there's a big difference between dogs. You can scold a dog, and the dog will assume the posture of submission, right? The posture of shame, because dogs are social animals. They hunt in packs. They're concerned with their status within a group. You can try scolding a cat, but the cat, for anyone who has a cat or who is owned by a cat, will know that the cat will just sort of go, yeah, whatever, and will not bow its head and will not assume the submission posture. That's because cats are alpha predators, and they are not social animals. They do not go in packs. There's a famous Rudyard Kipling story called The Cat Who Walked by Himself, in which the cat says, I am the cat who walks by myself, and all places are the same to me. You will not be surprised to discover that my mother, Helen Block Lewis, was a researcher as well as a psychoanalyst. And one of the studies she did was on gender differences in shame and guilt. And you will not be surprised to learn that women are more shame prone than men, whereas men are more prone to guilt. She wrote a book called Psychic War in Men and Women, in which she attributed the sex difference to the differences in the social position of men and women, and the fact that the demands of both the position of dominance and the position of subordination create insoluble moral conflicts for both sexes. She said men are more prone to guilt because they are expected to have a monopoly on violence and to do things like go to war. And that the expectation that they will enforce dominance with violence if necessary creates a conflict with their own affectionate nature and violates their attachments, their social attachments. And so that produces guilt, the sense of having done wrong, done something wrong. Whereas women are expected to be nurturing and caring, and yet are devalued, that their affectionate nature, which is fostered by a patriarchal system, their affectionate nature is devalued and considered inferior. And that creates a sense of social humiliation or shame. So I think you can explain the same attitudes on a cultural level by just looking at histories of conquest, where the dominant culture will consider itself superior to the culture that has been conquered. And so Ruth Benedict writes about, the Northern European emphasis on guilt and the Japanese emphasis on social status, and more highly values the ethos of the conqueror. Of course, we are as much of a shame culture as a guilt culture. There's a famous quote from Lyndon Johnson, who was president of the United States during the war in Vietnam, and who knew perfectly well that the United States was losing the war, but could not bear to admit it, because the idea that a second-rate colonial power would beat, the triumphalist imperial United States was simply too shaming for him, and he couldn't bear it. And so he refused to end the war and resigned from his presidency, kind of withdrew the way Coriolanus withdrew, if you like, or Achilles, rather than admit his diminished status in the eyes of his countrymen. So let me stop at this point. I do think the issue of repairing the harm versus restoring status to the victim is in some ways for everything short of murder, and in some ways a moot point, because part of, as my informants testified, the harm of sexual violence, gender-based violence, the physical harms were in some ways indistinguishable from the social humiliation that they suffered, and that repairing, and that is why in some ways repairing the harm, restitution, retribution even required all of the complicit members of society to make amends as well as the perpetrator. But that is something we can discuss.
Thank you so much, Judy. This is, you can easily see why, in Paul Doro's account, can I be heard? Yeah, that women avengers would be given a more complex character because in the social construction of the genders, for men, it's a natural kind of response, and they will repress any notion of shame that they might have suffered as a result of what was inflicted on them, and act only as though it were mere retaliation and retribution. So it explains very clearly the difference. We now have, we could go directly, we have a second commentator, Paola Correa, who is also here with us, and we'll hear her, and then we'll open up the floor to questions and conversation with me and with our invited guests.
Thank you very much, Professor Judith Herman. Bom dia, Paula. Muito obrigada por estar aqui conosco, por aceitar participar dessa 7ª conferência do professor Konstan. A professora Paula da Cunha Correia é amiga, colega há muitos anos, não só do professor Konstan, como da gente também. Ela é especialista em arquíloco, um autor de poesia de invectiva, né, do século VI a.C., famoso também por seus poemas líricos de vingança e retaliação. Além disso, a professora Paula tem se especializado na teoria da música antiga, né? Então, somos todos ouvidos, Paula.
Muito obrigada, Isabela. Queria agradecer a você e toda a equipe da IDEA e dar o parabéns por esse evento e essas aulas. E infelizmente, eu gostaria de estar aí, mas como eu tinha atividades aqui à tarde, não foi possível. Mas eu queria saber, eu faço a pergunta, Isabela, em português ou em inglês? Como que eu devo proceder?
Pode fazer em inglês mesmo, se possível.
Assim é mais
Sim.
fácil, não precisa traduzir, né?
Exato.
Tá bom. So, thank you very much, both Professor David Konstan and Judith Herman, for both of your papers, and Professor Judith was also included in Professor Konstan's. So I find this distinction between retribution and revenge very interesting to think about. And as Isabella said, I work with Archilochus, and I started to think about these two categories or patterns in the poems and in the poetic genre. So I would like to know your thoughts, both David and Professor Judith, on these two categories in Archilochus, because I find both in iambic poetry and maybe in old comedy, similarly, both of these, retribution and revenge, they operate, but on different levels. For example, in Archilochus, you have in the narrative framework, in the fable of the eagle and the fox, a very clear pattern of retribution, because you have an inferior animal, the fox, that suffers the wrongdoing by the eagle that eats his young. He is impotent, so he appeals to Zeus, that will then punish the eagle, and the punishment is exactly the same. wrongdoing, he suffers. The fox loses her cubs, and the eagle, when she gets the meat from the altar, she inadvertently kills her own young. So the retribution is eye for eye. This within the poem. But if you think of what the iambic poet does in the outer framework that we do not have from his poems, but from tradition, whether you take this at face value as biographical or not, this I think is irrelevant here. I believe the pattern is that of revenge. The poet, he shames his enemies through these poems, and tradition has it that those he attacks, the Lycambids, in the end, they kill themselves because of this shame they suffered. And why does the poet do this? Within this narrative, biographic narrative, he was shamed for being denied marriage with one of the Lycambids. So I see on one level within the poem the pattern of retribution, but outside, and as a characteristic maybe of the iambic poetry, revenge. Because the poet, through his poems, he seeks some kind of acknowledgement in the eyes of the community at large. And I found it interesting to note this censor, this attitude toward revenge that we already find in antiquity in Pindar. When Pindar, he despises this kind of poetry, and he speaks of Archilochus as somebody who gets fat on hatred. So he censures this hatred, this anger of the iambic poetry, as we see in these modern cases. So I would like to know, hear your opinions on that, both of you, on this, how this the revenge patterns and retribution patterns can be associated in a way, but how the iambic poetry would be more associated to the revenge than to retribution itself.
Good. Let me begin by thanking you very much. That was a brilliant analysis of that poem. I wrote an article quite some years ago, which happened to have been published in Classica, the journal of the Brazilian Classic Society, in which I offered a distinction, not nearly as subtle as what you have done now, between what I called invective poetry, poetry of insult, and satire. And the distinction I drew was that invective poetry, poetry of insult, is motivated by anger. At that time, I wasn't distinguishing between retribution and revenge, whereas satire is motivated by indignation. Satire sees injustice, whereas invective is organized, and I don't remember whether I said anything like this, around shame and status. And your description gives me more confidence in what I wrote then, but also adds the dimension that the invective poet, like any great poet, can insert within his own invective poem a narrative that explores the other side, that explores retribution as opposed to revenge in the terms that I have given it. So it enriches very much what I had suggested about this contrast. I had been using Hipponax and Archilochus, two archaic poets of invective, in contrast with satire, which is a characteristically Roman genre from what we have, and was using juveniles as the case, juvenile satires. So I would very much welcome your analysis, and I see it as deepening the point that I was making. Judith, have you a comment on this?
Yes. How's that? I agree with what you've said. It's a very interesting distinction. I would like to add another variable into the mix, which is the idea of amends, because I don't think it's either that idea isn't found in it's not eye for an eye, because that doesn't repair the harm. And it's not repairing the status either. It's trying to actually do something positive. And I think it's one of the actually most positive ideas in restorative justice is that rather than seeking punishment for the laws that have been broken, you're looking to repair the harm that has been done, however, to whatever extent that's possible. I mean, obviously with murder, it's not possible. But with crimes short of murder, what can the offender do to be readmitted to the community by not just apologizing, but showing a willingness to repay or repair in whatever manner that would be most productive. So when my informant Daniel said, I want Cardinal Law to, give up his scepter and his diamond ring and his mansion and sell the proceeds and give the money to services for victims, that's making amends in a way that I think isn't envisioned in either revenge or retribution.
I would perhaps draw a distinction between restorative justice, as it's usually practiced, and your conclusions in your book, Judith. The restorative justice puts the very strong emphasis on the individual relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. You have a situation of forgiveness. It's an idealized situation of forgiveness. The perpetrator, the person who does the harm, by exchanging views and being confronted with the harm that she or he has done, is to experience a kind of conversion. And the victim in that same moment is to experience a change of self, a restoration of the sense of self. But it's very much individualized. And restorative justice always presents itself as ancillary, as a companion to the legal system, rather than as a replacement. Whereas I find the victim's reports and desires and ambitions and sense of what they want, it depends on a much larger group. It's cardinal law they want to see, and he's well named in this case. They want to see the law and all that the law represents recognize their status. So I think that what emerges for me from your book is a version of restoration that is far superior to what restorative justice has been. And restorative justice is a movement that has been extremely popular in certain countries, Australia, Canada, a number of others, Denmark. It has also received some criticisms, which we looked at earlier in one of the earlier lectures.
I totally agree with your critique of restorative justice. I think it's a kind of a mix of a certain amount of appropriation of indigenous practices plus Christian pacifism with an enormous emphasis on forgiveness, and I think it sidesteps a lot of problems, including fact finding. I mean, it depends completely on the confession of the harm doer. and it pressure, I think, unduly pressures people toward forgiveness. But conceptually, rather than as it has been practiced so far, I think the idea of repairing harm and trying to create a virtuous cycle rather than punishing the eye for eye, countering harm with harm is a very interesting idea.
I wonder whether we might now open the floor to some questions from those in the audience here, and even the live audience, and also an extensive online audience. Any questions in the room, or comments, or thoughts on some of the... Roni, you seem to have a question there?
Yes.
Let's ask Roni. And you need a microphone and speak loud.
Hi, Professor. You could speak more about the sense of isolation in Achilles, Coriolanus, and the victims of sexual abuse. I want to know more about the connection between this sense of being alienated and revenge. I want to... Being alienated.
The sense of being alienated and isolated, and also alienation and isolation.
Okay, the sense, the question is then between this sense of alienation caused by certain kinds of harm and revenge. I will give a preliminary response, and then we can have our guests also help out here. I have been suggesting that when a person suffers an extreme kind of dishonor, we don't use that expression so much in the language today, honor as we do dignity, but let's say a deep compromise of their personal dignity. And if no one else acknowledges this, then we are alienated. We feel removed. We feel we're outside the room. We're not included in the community. And that sense of exclusion is painful on several levels. We are social beings. We need to be part of something. To withdraw into ourselves and not have the ability to express ourselves to others causes legitimate anger to be converted into what Judith Herman has called rage, helpless rage. And that helpless rage, in that condition, when you're in that state of helpless rage, then the fantasies become out of control. That's when the anger that motivates revenge really becomes antisocial. But anger as a proper and understandable response to your own desire for reintegration into the community, which cannot happen only by your own will and by your submission. That won't do the trick. What you need is the social recognition at large. And I would say, I think I'm here being entirely faithful to Judith Herman's interpretation, that it is a recognition simultaneously of your personal status and the status of all those who have been diminished because they share in your experience. By which I mean that everyone, not only who has necessarily suffered sexual abuse, but who has been vulnerable to it. Not only everyone who has suffered racial discrimination, but those who have been vulnerable to it. Not only those who have suffered extreme poverty and the need to be always gracious to their masters, but all those who have had any experience of it. It is the restoration of all of them simultaneously that and I think that's why Judith Herman gave that vision of a time when there will not be a need for shame and for diminution as the ultimate goal of what is required even for our individual recovery. And this is not to say that individual recovery is not possible, just that there is always a sense that it is what anger and shame and the desire for revenge sounds strange. What they ultimately aim at is a restoration of dignity everywhere, so that not only have we not suffered it, but we are no longer vulnerable to suffering it. And that is why I think I called revenge a progressive, socially progressive emotion. Any comments here?
Just to amplify a little bit of what David said, shame is repaired by eye contact, smiling, and laughing together. Shame is about being laughed at or being viewed with contempt. And the repair of shame involves feeling of belonging, feeling that one is respected and welcomed and part of a community. So, and when those conditions apply, the anger of the humiliated person just dissipates. It's very, you don't need to say, don't be angry, that's bad. If you smile at the person and say, they're there, it's, we still love you, we respect you, the anger goes away.
Paula is a world authority, the authority on Archilochus, fat volumes that explain it all to us. And I wonder whether you see anything in ancient invective or poetry or a Stephanic sense of comedy that conforms to this sense, that integration. Because Archilochus simply wants, he achieves his goal, yes, by inflicting shame on his would-be father-in-law and her daughter, whose marriage was denied him, like Lycambes. But is there any sense in these invective poets that integration would be possible?
To think about this, but I'm not finding integration there. Not in iambic poetry. Perhaps in comedy, it would be easier. But invective has its role, but I think it's a bit different.
I think that's right. Invective as a genre, when Paula refers to iambic poetry, it's a name for that genre of invective because it was characterized by a particular meter. Invective poetry is the howl and cry of somebody whose revenge fantasies have not really been fulfilled. Whereas, and as a result, invective has no plot. But comedy does have a plot, and it looks to an ending. There is a motive, and so in the narrative, I think, yes, one can find characters who are upset and humiliated. The only difference is that in Aristophanic comedy, it's more often a restoration of justice, a sense of fairness that's at stake. Where shame might better come in is in the comedies that we've already looked at very partially, of Menander and Plautus and Terence, where these new comedies that are the basis of modern situation comedies that are more characterized by shame. It's a question that would be worth our thinking further about.
Yes, thank you very much for the answers. I'm really thinking on some plots in Plautus, for instance, in Miles Gloriosus, when the military is beaten by another old man and so on, as a result of a plot inside a plot, but also as a result of his own character during the whole play. So we see it as a but in thinking about isolation, alienation, what I remember from Archilochus is that the invective tries to isolate, and that the other one while putting a shame on him. So isolation seems to me, from what I remember, what we feel like while reading the poems. So I'm just agreeing with you, and thank you very much for the answers, because they make really very much sense for me. And how interesting the Archilochus texts, as I mentioned, are dated from 60th century before Christ. So I was wondering, these feelings communicate to us, and at the same time make us thinking on the difference between their configurations, no? As Professor David so brilliant shows in his books.
I would mention one thing about Archilochus. He is a soldier, and I like his poem in which he says he doesn't like a general with a fancy helmet and rich armor, but who's a coward. He wants a soldier whose legs, call them bandy legs, whose legs are like this, and he's short and he's ugly. You can see why I feel an identification here. And who is a good soldier and brave. In other words, he already sees himself among the lower group with a commander over him. And that situates him personally in a way to share the social integration of the lower classes and a certain resentment of the upper classes.
Yes, and I just wanted to remember Archilochus is even older, Isabella. He's from the 7th century.
Yes, it's your thesis, sorry. I remember. It's closer to Homer than it's her thesis, yes? She defends it brilliantly, and then I just forgot it. Sorry, Paula.
No problem.
Yes, her doctorate thesis just shows us the dialogues or proximities between Archilochus and Homer in terms of time and imagination and so on. So I'm making it smaller, Paula, but it's very interesting. Do you have other questions on the here and online? No questions. I was just wondering, it's not a question but a commentary. I was wondering, when we read such texts, modern texts and ancient texts, how do we feel Archilochus so close? We tend to say, oh, Catullus is very modern, Archilochus is very modern. We identify we relate it to modern narratives, real modern narratives, like those that Professor Judith Herman studies and presents, and we identify it to films and modern dramaturgy. Do you, and I was, maybe it's so obvious, but I'm putting this impression, maybe these points, emotions, and these feelings of, the ideas of, the notions of revenge and retributions are points that we identified at least at the first view. Is this identification that causes this feeling of modernity in ancient texts? Do you think we could say like that, David? Or it helps this approach?
I'll make a quick answer, then open it up to the others. There are differences. When Aristotle says that you feel angry only at an insult and a diminution of your status, he is limiting anger quite a bit. He is responding to a world that is a culture in which maintaining your dignity in public is a constant challenge, in which anger is mostly a response to the way you have been potentially insulted or not. What is interesting is that Aristotle's conception of anger has long been neglected and thought of as irrelevant. I've mentioned earlier, for example, that Aristotle claims that you can't be angry at somebody you're afraid of. And that this seems completely counterintuitive until you realize that if anger is a desire for revenge, but that's what he says it is. Now, we don't necessarily say that. If anger is a desire for revenge, and you can't feel anger if you cannot realize it, revenge, and you can't realize revenge against the person you're afraid of, then it all falls into place. But it only falls into place after you've made these moves to situate yourself in Aristotle's thought world. That's when it happens. So it's different. What is interesting is that Aristotle's way of thinking is not wholly alien to us either. And that when brought into relationship, connection with some of the more advanced notions of social life today, of why it is that shame, guilt, feelings of revenge and retribution are more than simply personal, do involve questions of status and dignity, dignity being the modern term for honor. We see more of a connection with Aristotle without abolishing the distance between his cultural assumptions and our own. That would be my general answer.
Oh, if there is not other questions, I thank you very much for this answer, and also our dear guests, Professor Judith Herman and Professor Paula Cunha Correia. And I thank everybody that's here listening to this 7th lecture. And we are announcing that next week we will have the final lecture of Professor Konstan, who will be hosted by Professor José Turrano from the University of São Paulo. He's also a professor of Greek language and literature. And we'll have Professor Márcio Seligman from the house, so Unicamp. And we will hear about revenge and genocide with the moderation of these two professors. So I hope to see you again there. And until then, have a nice day.
Thank you, Isabella.
Thank you. Thank you for having us and for this lovely.
Thanks to all of you. My thanks to all. Okay. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye. See you soon.